If he slaps you once, he'll probably do it again. She arrived at work carrying a bouquet so big that people stopped to admire it. Wow, one colleague smiled. You're such a lucky girl. Oh, look at those flowers. My man could never. She laughed, but she wasn't laughing because it was funny. She was laughing because nobody knew those flowers had arrived just 24 hours after he had wrapped his hands around her neck. Nobody knew that she had spent the previous night lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether she was in the right kind of relationship. Nobody knew that she had already decided to stay regardless, hoping that he would change. It's interesting, isn't it? If she had walked into work with a black eye, everyone would have been horrified. But because she walked in carrying roses, everyone assumed that she was loved. Sometimes, you see, the things that look most romantic are actually covering the deepest wounds. And that brings me to one of the most repeated phrases on the internet. If he slaps you once, he'll do it again. You've probably heard it. You may have even said it. But as someone studying psychotherapy, I don't think that's the most interesting question. The better question is this: what predicts whether someone becomes violent again? Because here's the truth: some people become violent once and spend the rest of their lives making sure it never happens again. Others cry, apologize, buy flowers, promise they'll change, swear it was the last time, and then do it again. So the question is, what makes the difference? Today, I want us to look at this through the lens of psychology, not social media, not opinion, not fear, psychology, because understanding why violence happens doesn't excuse it, but it might help us recognize it sooner. It might help us protect ourselves. And for the person watching who recognizes themselves in this conversation, it might be the beginning of taking responsibility before another person gets hurt. Now, the slap didn't start with the slap. Most people think violence begins the moment someone raises their hand. Psychologically, that's really true. The slap is often the final chapter of a story that began much earlier. It begins with beliefs like, I have to win every argument. If I feel disrespected, someone has to pay. My emotions are your responsibility. If you loved me, you wouldn't make me angry. Those beliefs don't appear overnight. They grow quietly, sometimes over the years, sometimes from childhood, sometimes from watching violence become normal. Now, I need to say something really important here. Having a traumatic childhood does not make someone abusive. Millions of people grow up in painful homes and never become violent. Trauma can increase vulnerability, it never removes responsibility. And that's a distinction we have to protect because explaining behavior is not the same and as excusing it. So, why does the first slap happen? People often say it was just anger, but violence is really just about anger. Think about the last time you were angry, really angry. Did you hit someone? Probably not. Why? Because anger by itself does not make people violent. Violence usually happens when anger meets something else: poor emotional regulation, a need for control, entitlement, shame, jealousy, fear of abandonment, rigid beliefs about power, or a lifetime of never learning another way to handle conflict. The slap isn't just an emotional reaction, it's a behavioral choice, a dangerous one, and that's why it's taken so seriously. Now, here's why many people get confused. They think the biggest danger is the slap. It isn't. The biggest danger is often the story that comes afterwards. He didn't mean it. He was just under a lot of stress. He lost his job. He's never done this before. I shouldn't have shouted back. If I just stayed quiet. Notice something? The focus slowly shifts away from the person who chose violence and onto the person who experienced it. That's one of the most dangerous psychological shifts that can happen after abuse, because now the question isn't why did he hit me, it's what could I have done differently. And those two are completely different questions. Now let me ask you something. If your best friend came to your house tonight and she told you her partner had slapped her for the first time, would your first question be, what did you do? Or would it be, are you safe? Most of us know the answer when it's someone else. It's much harder when it's us, because love has a way of making us negotiate with things we would never accept for the other people we care about. And that's exactly where the flowers come in. Not because flowers are bad, but because they are often mistaken for evidence. Flowers are not evidence of change. Tears are not evidence of change. Promises are not evidence of change. They are evidence of emotion. And emotion is not the same thing as transformation. So if apologies aren't enough, if tears aren't enough, if guilt isn't enough, then what actually tells us whether someone is changing? That's a good question. That is where psychology gives us an answer that social media rarely does. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. If he slaps you once, will he do it again? So, what actually predicts whether someone will become violent again? Oddly enough, it isn't how much they cry. It isn't how expensive the flowers are. It isn't how convincing the apology sounds. Because psychology it has taught us something that most of us don't naturally understand. Remorse and accountability are not the same thing. And confusing the two can be incredibly dangerous. Think about it. Someone can feel genuinely guilty. They can hate themselves for what they did. They can cry until there are no tears left. They can even, believe with all of their heart that they will never do it again. And then they do. Why? Because emotion doesn't automatically produce transformation. Behavior changes when thinking changes. Behavior changes when beliefs are challenged. Behavior changes when someone consistently learns healthier ways to regulate themselves. Feeling bad about what you've done isn't the same about becoming a different person. And that is why an apology on its own is never enough evidence. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying apologies don't matter. They do. But an apology should be the beginning of change, not the evidence that change has already happened. There's a difference, a huge difference. Because remorse says, I'm sorry. Accountability says, I've accepted what I did. I have stopped blaming you for what I did. I have sought professional help. I am willing to face the consequences. I am committed to changing my behavior, even if it takes years. One is emotional, the other is behavioral. And psychology is far more interested in behavior than beautiful speeches. So, why do so many people stay after the first incident? This is probably one of the most misunderstood parts of abusive relationships. People watching from the outside often ask, why didn't you just leave? But that's the wrong question. The better question is, what was happening inside her mind that made leaving feel so impossible? Because people rarely stay, because they are in love. They stay because human beings are wired for hope, especially when the person who hurt us is also the person comforting us. Think back to the woman with the flowers. The night before, she was terrified. The next day, she was being told that she was loved. Can you see how confusing that is? Her nervous system had gone from fear to relief. And here's something I wish more people understood: relief is not the same thing as safety. Let me say that again. Relief is not the same thing as safety. Imagine you've been holding your breath underwater. Eventually, you come up for air. The moment you breathe, Your body feels enormous relief, but that doesn't mean the water wasn't dangerous. In abusive relationships, the apology often creates relief. The flowers create relief. The tears create relief. The affection creates relief. And because our brains are trying to reduce the distress, we often mistake that relief for evidence that everything is going to be okay. But those are two very different things. This is one of the reasons why abusive relationships become so psychologically complicated, because the same person who creates the fear also creates the source of comfort. That creates a powerful emotional bond, not because the relationship is healthy, but because the nervous system becomes trapped in a cycle of fear and relief. Psychologists often refer to this as trauma bonding. And contrary to what many people think, trauma bonding isn't about loving abuse. It's about becoming emotionally attached through repeated cycles of harm, apology, comfort, and hope. Hope keeps saying maybe this time will be different, even when the evidence keeps saying otherwise. The cycle that people don't notice, right? Many abusive relationships follow a pattern. Not perfectly, not every single time, but often enough that psychologists have recognized it for decades. It begins with tension. You can feel something changing. Arguments become more frequent. The atmosphere shifts. You start walking on eggshells. You become careful about what you say, careful about your tone, careful about your facial expressions. Then comes the incident. It might be shouting, threats, intimidation, pushing, slapping, or more severe violence. Then comes the part most people recognize, the apology, the tears, the gifts, the promises, the affection, sometimes even spiritual language. I've prayed about it. God is working on me. I know I'll never do this again. And for a little while, things really do seem better. The relationship feels peaceful again, almost like the violence never even happened. And that's exactly why the cycle is so difficult to leave. Because you're not living through constant fear, you're living through alternating fear and hope, fear and relief, fear and affection. And hope can be incredibly persuasive, especially when it's attached to someone you love. But here's the difficult truth: a peaceful week is not evidence of lasting change, neither is a peaceful month. The real question is not how does this person behave after they've hurt me? No. The real question is who are they becoming over time? Because genuine change isn't measured in days, it's measured in patterns. Patterns tell us far more than promises ever will. So now we arrive at the question that divides psychologists, churches, families, and social media. Can people who become violent actually change? The answer might surprise you. My answer is probably not the one social media wants, because social media loves certainty. People never change, or love conquers everything. Psychology is usually more honest than that. It says some people do change, but not for the reasons most people think, and certainly not as often as many people hope. Before I go any further, I want to say something very clearly. If someone has become physically violent towards you, your first priority should never be trying to fix them. Your first priority is your safety, your emotional safety, your physical safety, your children's safety. That is, if children are involved. Understanding why someone behaves the way they do should never come at the expense of protecting yourself. Now, with that said, let's talk about what genuine change actually looks like, because this is where many people get confused. They think change begins with regret. It doesn't. It begins with responsibility. Those are two very different things. Regret sounds like this: I didn't mean it. I was angry. I don't know what came over me. I hate myself. I can't believe I did that to you. Those statements may even be true, but none of them by themselves predict change. Why? Because they are still focused on how I feel. Real accountability sounds different. I chose to hurt you. I've stopped blaming you. What I did was abuse. I need professional help. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences come from my actions. Can you hear the difference? One person is describing their emotions, the other person is taking ownership of their behavior. Psychologically, that is a massive shift because people rarely change until they stop defending the version of themselves that caused the harm. Now, here's something that surprised me when I first started studying psychology. People don't change because they are told to. They don't even change because they desperately want to. Most lasting change happens when three things come together. Three things. The first is awareness. The person recognizes the truth about their behavior without minimizing it. Not, I only slapped you. Not, it wasn't that bad. Not, at least I didn't know. They call it exactly what it is: violence. The second is accountability. They don't expect forgiveness to erase responsibility. They don't ask everyone to move on while refusing to do the work on themselves. Instead, they willingly step into uncomfortable conversations. They seek help. They remain teachable. They stop making excuses. And then comes the third part: practice. Because emotional regulation is a skill, healthy communication is a skill, managing conflict without intimidation is a skill, learning to tolerate frustration is a skill. No one becomes emotionally safe simply because they cried after losing control. They become safer because over months and years they repeatedly practice different ways of responding. That is why therapy matters. Not because therapy magically changes people, no, 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 but because it gives people the opportunity to examine the beliefs, emotional patterns, and coping strategies that have been running their lives for years. Now, I want to say something that may challenge some of you. Trauma can explain behavior, it cannot excuse abuse. Those are not the same thing. I have enormous compassion for people who grew up in violent homes, children who learned that shouting solved problems, children who watched one parent control another, children who never experienced healthy repair after conflict. Those experiences matter. They shape us, they influence us, but they do not remove our responsibility because if trauma excused abuse, then every survivor of childhood abuse would grow up to become abusive. And we know that's simply not true. Many survivors become some of the gentlest, safest people you will ever meet, which tells us something very important. Our past influences us, it does not imprison us. So, what predicts genuine change? If I met someone who had become physically violent towards their partner, right? These are the things I'd be paying attention to. Not how emotional they are, not how convincing they sound. I'd be looking for evidence. Have they accepted full responsibility without blaming their partner? Have they sought specialist help without being forced? Are they consistently attending therapy or a recognized intervention program? Have they become open to challenge instead of defensive? Do the people closest to them see lasting changes in how they handle frustration, disappointment, and conflict? Has enough time passed to see a genuine pattern rather than a temporary effort? Because you see, here's the thing: behavior leaves evidence, promises don't. Anyone can promise. Change has to be observed, not imagined. And this brings us back to the woman with the flowers. Imagine she asks me, Remi, do you think he'll change? Do you know what my answer would be? I wouldn't answer the question. I'd ask her one instead. What evidence do you have? Not what are you hoping? Not what did he promise? Not how sincere did he sound? What evidence do you have? Because hope is beautiful, but hope without evidence can become incredibly dangerous. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is stop believing potential and start paying attention to patterns. Now, I want to speak directly to two groups of people watching this. First, I want to speak to the person who has experienced violence. Maybe this video feels uncomfortably familiar. Maybe no one knows what has been happening behind closed doors. Maybe you've become very good at smiling in public and crying in private. If this is you, I want you to hear me carefully. I am not going to tell you what decision you have to make. That decision is deeply personal. It can also be incredibly dangerous depending on your circumstances. What I do want to do is help you think clearly because abuse has a way of making people doubt what they already know. So instead of asking yourself, does he love me? Try asking a different question. Do I feel safe around this person? Am I becoming more confident or am I slowly becoming smaller? Do I find myself changing my behavior to avoid upsetting them? Have I started hiding the truth from the people who care about me? If this happened to my daughter, what would I tell her? Sometimes we are far kinder to other people than we are to ourselves. Sometimes we can recognize danger in someone else's story long before we recognize it in our own. And if you've answered those questions honestly, and you've realized that you are not safe, please don't carry that burden on your own. Tell someone you trust, a trusted friend, a family member, a faith leader who understands abuse, a trained professional. If you are in immediate danger, contact the emergency services where you live. You don't have to prove that things are bad enough before asking for help. You deserve the support before the worst happens, not after. Now, I want to speak to a different person. The person who has been sitting here quietly thinking, she's talking about me. Maybe you've shouted. Maybe you've pushed. Maybe you slapped someone, right? Maybe you've become someone you never thought you'd become. If that is you, I need you to hear me. You are responsible for what you have done, completely responsible. But responsibility is not the same thing as hopelessness. You do not have to remain the person you are today. You can change, but only if you're willing to tell yourself the truth. Not the comfortable truth, the whole truth, the truth that says, I am no longer emotionally safe for the person I say I love. That's not an easy sentence to say, but healing really begins with comfort. It begins with honesty. If you genuinely want to change, don't make your partner your therapist. Don't ask them to monitor your progress. Don't expect them to absorb the cost of your healing. Go and get help. Work with a qualified therapist. If appropriate, engage with a recognized program for people who have used violence in relationships. Learn emotional regulation. Learn how to tolerate frustration without intimidation. Learn how to recognize your triggers before they become someone else's injuries. And if alcohol or drugs make your behavior worse, address that too. Because saying, I only hit you because I was drunk, doesn't solve the problem. It simply tells you another problem also needs attention. Most importantly, stop measuring your progress by how guilty you feel. Measure it by how safely you behave. Because guilt comes and goes. Behavior is what protects people. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought. Let's go back to the woman with the flowers. Imagine we meet her 5 years later. There are two possible endings to her story. In the first ending, she's still receiving flowers. They are just arriving after every incident. The apologies have become more polished. The promises more convincing, the hope more exhausting. She's still waiting for the version of him she keeps believing is just around the corner. In the second ending, she buys herself flowers. Not because life has suddenly become perfect, not because healing has been easy, but because one day she realized something. Love is not supposed to make me question my safety. Love is not supposed to make me rehearse explanations for bruises. Love is not supposed to make fear feel normal. Real love leaves room for honesty, for respect, for accountability, for repair, for safety. And if those things are missing, then what you're protecting may not be the relationship. It may simply be the hope that one day it will become the relationship you always wanted. Sometimes that hope is justified. Sometimes people do the hard work. Sometimes they genuinely change. But hope should never ask you to ignore evidence. That is the difference. Now, if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's conversation, it's this. People do not change because they cried. They don't change because they promised. They don't change because they bought flowers. They change because they become brutally honest about who they've become and commit day after day to the difficult work of becoming someone safe. And if you're the one waiting for change, don't measure it by words. Don't measure it by gifts. Don't even measure it by emotion. Measure it by consistent behavior over time because behavior tells the truth that words sometimes hide. Thank you so much for watching. If this conversation helped you see something differently, I'd really love you to share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if psychology through story is something you're passionate about, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Take very good care of yourself.